Welcome to the Bloomberg Daybreak Asia podcast. I'm Doug Krisner. On today's episode, we'll be taking a look at the outlook for China's industrial economy. We'll be speaking with Xiao Feng, co-head of China Industrial Research at CLSA, plus a look at the life and legacy of former U.S. President Jimmy Carter. But first, a look at the top story in the Asia Pacific. Investigators are probing the cause of South Korea's worst civil aviation accident ever. 179 occupants of a Boeing 737 are dead after the aircraft skidded along the runway on its belly before smashing into a wall and then exploding into a ball of fire. The aircraft was operated by South Korea's Jeju Air. The crash occurred at Muan International Airport on Sunday morning. Only a pair of flight attendants survived. For more on this tragic story, let's bring in Bloomberg's Danny Lee. He covers Asia transport from our bureau in Hong Kong. Danny, thank you for joining us. I'm sorry about the circumstances. The pilot apparently issued a Mayday emergency call after what was described as a bird strike warning. What do we know about this?
So the bird strike warning was given to pilots by the airport staff and air traffic control in the minutes before the landing. Now, this is a critical phase of flight for pilots to, obviously navigate safely and land. And after this bird strike warning, there was a Mayday call from the pilots. They had suffered a bird strike, and then subsequently, minutes later, the crash happened, and there was some spectacular footage showing the lead up to the crash and then the actual crash itself, which is just so devastating. This high speed belly landing with the landing gears not deployed, and just this aircraft, this Boeing 737-800 jet sliding along the runway, almost seemingly not slowing down in any way and crashing into the embankment at high speed. And this fireball that erupted, and just this plane basically completely destroyed subsequently. So these are potential points for the investigators to want to look at: the bird strike, the Mayday call, and the possible landing gear malfunction as well. So ultimately, there is a lot for investigators to look at, but there is also a lot of things that they need to keep their mind open for, because anything could have happened, and they need to scrutinize so much in the days and weeks and months to come.
A vital piece of information that we will get on the circumstances surrounding this disaster will come from the readout of the two flight recorders. Do we know anything as to whether or not these recorders were recovered fully intact?
So we know that the two flight recorders, the cockpit voice recorder and the flight data recorder, were recovered, but one of these boxes was damaged. And so there is an assessment being done now to see the extent of the damage and whether that damage means that the boxes themselves, at least one of the boxes, can be analyzed properly in the country, or whether this now has to be taken outside of the country to be analysed, and that could take time, and that's time which could be frustrating because people want answers quickly to what happened in what is South Korea's worst civil aviation disaster now ever.
So I indicated earlier that this was a 737-800 Boeing aircraft. Do we know anything about whether or not Boeing will be involved in the investigation, or whether U.S. authorities will join in?
We have heard from Boeing and the U.S. National Transportation Safety Board. They've both said that they will support or be involved to an extent in the investigation. They will not be leading this because it's not necessarily within their jurisdiction, but given the manufacturer of the aircraft and where it was from, they will always have a role to play here. And it goes without saying that for this crash and for this type of aircraft, clearly there has been a lot of scrutiny on Boeing, but this type of aircraft, which is, we must stress, not one of the newer Boeing 737 MAX jet variants, this type of aircraft, there's 4,000 of these in service. So it is an incredibly well-used, very popular aircraft and incredibly safe. And given the unfortunate milestone of this crash being the worst in South Korea's history, it's taken over 20 years for this to become a new what to call it, a milestone, unfortunate, grim milestone to be made in this. And so, it goes without saying that for aviation, it's still incredibly safe. It's just an unfortunate time that there's so much attention on the aviation industry at large, with so many incidents, big and small, happening.
Danny, what can you tell me about Jeju Air? I mean, what type of carrier is this?
So Jeju Air is a budget carrier, a mid-sized carrier that only started in 2005 and has grown to operate an all-Boeing fleet of 42 aircraft. And so, it's a very focused carrier flying around the Asia region. And so, unfortunately for them, this crash is their first fatal accident. And they had one other small accident previously, many, many years ago, but they've been an incredibly safe operator. And that doesn't seem like that would ever change ultimately, but given the scrutiny, clearly there'll be a lot of questions on Jeju Air, and particularly its pilots, its operations, and obviously how it handles this particular case going forward.
Danny, thank you so much for joining us and helping us better understand this tragic story. Danny Lee covers the aviation industry for Bloomberg News, joining us on the Daybreak Asia podcast. Welcome back to the Bloomberg Daybreak Asia podcast. I'm Doug Krisner. It's going to be a holiday-shortened week in markets. Several will be closed or will close early Tuesday and Wednesday. Even so, we're expecting a couple of key data points, and among them in Asia, readings on the health of the Chinese economy. We'll be getting both the official and the private PMI surveys. For a closer look, I'm joined now by Feng. He is co-head of China Industrial Research at CLSA, joining us from our studios in Hong Kong. Feng, thank you so much for making the time to chat with us. Let's start with the sentiment readings that we're expecting for China, the PMI surveys. How do you think things will look for China?
I think overall, things are still recovering. If you look at the PMI reading, which is about to release tomorrow, and also the industrial production, profits data, everything's really pointing to a recovery pace. But with that being said, I think the recovery is not really as strong or as fast as we would like to see. What I can say is the worst is definitely behind us. If you look at the industrial profits and inventory levels here, the orders from equipment makers, which is usually a good indicator of industrial demand, suggest double-digit growth starting from the second half of the year. In the meanwhile, we are seeing the book order numbers from overseas producers also are working fine or working on the favor of the Chinese producers. So generally, I think the worst is behind us, but the recovery pace definitely needs to be much stronger.
One of the things about the PMI is that it's a sentiment reading, and I'm wondering whether or not some of what we are going to get in that PMI data for China this week will reflect maybe the threat of U.S. tariffs. Is that possible?
I think for the seasonality, yes, because usually towards the end of the year is the holiday season. Usually the buyers in the U.S. are trying to make the booking for the holiday sales. And in the meanwhile, because of the potential Trump tariffs, we are seeing some type of pre-orders from the U.S. sides and trying to get their inventories up to better prepare for the coming tariffs. Yes, we are seeing some type of front-loading thing.
One of the other things that I'm concerned about is the issue, what has been called by the U.S. as an overcapacity issue for China, and that relates to a number of industries, especially electric vehicles. What is your assessment on the degree to which we're going to begin to see maybe a little bit more in the way of consolidation in the Chinese EV space in 2025?
Yep, sure. So for now, I think when most of the people are talking about overcapacity or low capacity utilization for the EV industry, people refer to the whole industry data, which is right now running at around 40 to 50% of capacity utilization. It's very low. We have around 40 to 45 million units of capacities in China, while the auto sales is really 22, 23 million a year. But if you look at the structural issues here, EV makers in the meanwhile is running at a much higher capacity utilization, generally around 80% or above, while the ICE car makers, the traditional ICE car makers, are running at below 50%. So that's a structural difference here. So overall, I believe EV makers will continue that trend. They will be growing much more faster at the losses of the ICE makers. We are forecasting the passenger vehicle market to be at low single-digit growth next years. But in the meanwhile, EV will be growing at 25 to 30% versus 25 to 30% losses from the ICE car makers. The second thing is really the consolidations of the industry. We believe 2025 we will start to see a materialization of the industry consolidations, which already happening this year. We've seen some joint ventures shutting down their factories in China. We've seen some exit of the brands from the new forces of the EV makers, which will going to be materialized in 2025. So I think the industry consolidations will continue to help drive up the capacity utilizations.
When I think of EVs, I think of not only domestic demand, but I think of a very strong export market as well. But when it comes to the issue of domestic demand, how much more can the government be doing? There is a lot that's already been communicated. Are you expecting a lot more in terms of fiscal policy from Beijing in the year ahead?
So I used to cover commodities. If you are talking about the large scale stimulus like we saw in the 2009 after the financial crisis, we probably will be disappointed because from my perspective, I think the Chinese government will stop doing that kind of large-scale stimulus. Instead, we are seeing a shift of the policy focus from the production side, investment side, to the consumer side. In China, investment used to be a biggest growth driver, accounts for more than 1/3 of the fixed asset investment. But for now, with the shrinking of the property space and struggling local government financials, we're seeing the manufacturing industries, the value-adding industries are accounting for a larger share of the economy. So that's why going forward, we'll see the policy will be more focusing on driving the consumption rather than pushing for the production. This is what our reports has been saying, a change of the policy from push to pull. In the meanwhile, I believe the multiplier effect suggests that it has been working very well for the consumption stimulus policy. For example, the trading stimulus policy for autos has about 2 to 3 times of multiplier effect, meaning every dollar you're spending on driving the auto consumption, it's been generating $2 to $3 of economic growth. So that's why overall we believe we're going to see the shift. It has been working in their favor.
Xiao Feng, thank you so much for taking time to chat with us. Xiao Feng is co-head of China Industrial Research at CLSA, joining us here on the Daybreak Asia podcast. We move next to former U.S. President Jimmy Carter, who died on Sunday at the age of 100. Carter was the longest-living U.S. president in history. He died at his home in Plains, Georgia. In early 2023, Carter opted to spend his remaining time at home while receiving hospice care. For more on Carter's legacy, we heard from Bloomberg Wall Street Week host David Westin. He spoke with Bloomberg's Heidi Stroud-Watts.
David, really great to have you with us. As you sort of look at the retrospective of the former president's life, what sort of jumps out to you that perhaps, the mainstream, we haven't given him enough credit for?
Well, you hit, Heidi, on a couple of the big points that people will focus on, which is the Iranian hostage crisis, which was a terrible event. And there was also the oil crisis as we were lined up to get gas at the pump here. And, of course, stagflation. We had runaway inflation and stagnation. But as you suggest, there are some things I think people maybe have overlooked about Jimmy Carter, and that is particularly how it affected business and Wall Street. People overlook the fact that he was the one who appointed Paul Volcker to run the Fed, which really put inflation back in its place. Often people give Ronald Reagan, his successor, credit for that, but actually he put that in place. Similarly, deregulation that is associated with Ronald Reagan actually was started under Jimmy Carter with the appointment of Alfred Kahn from Cornell, who deregulated the airline. So he actually had quite an effect on the business community and on Wall Street, which we don't normally think of with respect to Jimmy Carter.
What do you think the most sort of, enduring parts of his legacy would be? And we do know that he was sort of quite visible in recent political cycles.
Well, listen, one of the most enduring parts of his presidency was what happened after his presidency, because he had the longest post-presidency of any U.S. president. And he received the Nobel Peace Prize for his actions around the world, promoting democracy and trying to police elections around the world, in addition to working on Habitat for Humanity, building housing here in the United States for the poor. So he had an amazing, I think most people would agree, the most remarkable post-presidency of any president, which I think will be an important part of his legacy. Another part of his legacy are the people that he influenced who were in his administration, who were young people at the time. He was something of a technocrat, having been a nuclear engineer in the U.S. Navy. And he went and hired the best and the brightest you could get. And those included some of the people who became leading lights on Wall Street, people like David Rubenstein and Roger Altman and Jane Hartley, who's just stepping down as our ambassador to Great Britain, as well as Ralph Schlosstein from Evercore. All these people were youngsters, really, at the time, in the Carter White House. And they were brought in specifically because he made a policy of going and finding the best and the brightest young people he could and bringing them into his administration.
You know, it was quite interesting to see that he had that final wish, right? He wanted to make it long enough to be able to cast his ballot for Kamala Harris, which obviously he was able to do. I do wonder, you know, if you sort of compare how we'll be ending the year, and we're, of course, going to be getting the state funeral that's been ordered by President Biden in the coming days, how much has politics and the landscape of, you know, the political arena for the US really changed since Jimmy Carter's time?
Obviously, it's changed really fundamentally. And it's important to remember with Jimmy Carter what he inherited. He came just in the aftermath of the debacle in Vietnam for the United States, and also just inherited a lot of the problems that came after Watergate and the questions about integrity. And he came in almost as an accidental president because people didn't want to reelect Gerald Ford because of that pardon. At the same time, as we look forward into the new year with Donald Trump returning to the White House, a couple of things strike me as ironic. One of the things that Jimmy Carter did was the Panama Canal Treaty, turning Panama Canal back to people in Panama, which now Donald Trump says that you would like to undo. And also, under Jimmy Carter, they created not one but two different departments of the United States government, which were energy and education. Once again, Donald Trump now campaigned on eliminating Department of Education. So we'll see, but Donald Trump has set out a pattern for himself that he would like to undo a lot of what Jimmy Carter did.
Bloomberg's David Westin there in New York.
Thanks for listening to today's episode of the Bloomberg Daybreak Asia Edition podcast. Each weekday, we look at the stories shaping markets, finance, and geopolitics in the Asia Pacific. You can find us on Apple, Spotify, the Bloomberg Podcast YouTube channel, or anywhere else you listen. Join us again tomorrow for insight on the market moves from Hong Kong to Singapore and Australia. I'm Doug Krisner, and this is Bloomberg.